You're listening to Harrowsmith Radio. I'm your host, Wayne McPhail. In this episode, a visit with that self-proclaimed culinary charlatan, Bob Blumer, whose new book teaches us all how to make bombs. Flavourbomb, that is. Speaking of making, our go-to DIY guy, Steve Maxell, is back, this time to explain why MIG welding is the glue gun of the future. So, bombs and welds, all in this episode. By the way, if you want to read Harrowsmith magazine instead of listen to it, you can subscribe to the print version online at harrowsmithmag.com. And you can find Harrowsmith magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. But for now, settle in for the next half hour of Harrowsmith Radio. Bob Blumer didn't start out life as a chef. He went to Western for business, sold heavy metal t-shirts at concerts, managed Canadian indie music queen Jane Sibery, and through a surreal cookbook for his sister, tumbled into a rollicking rock and roll journey into extreme cuisine. In his latest book, Flavourbomb, he explains how to dial the savory, sweet, bitter, sour, and umami of everyday dishes right past 11 in full-on Spinal Tap style. Here's our conversation. Hey, Bob, thanks very much for joining us. I want to start off by talking about your background because you're focused on food in the book, obviously, and amping up the flavor of food. But you didn't start out as a chef. You started out as a guy selling T-shirts for heavy metal bands and being a manager for Jane Sibery. So tell me a bit about that and then how you sort of pivoted into doing what you're doing now.
That was a long time ago, but I actually went to business school at the University of Western Ontario. But I always wanted to get into the music business, and so I did that. And my entree into the business was touring with bands, lots of big bands like AC/DC and Def Leppard, selling T-shirts. And often, I graduated from business school, and then there I was literally selling T-shirts. My mother was bawling her eyes out, I think.
Especially when she found out you were being called a T-shirt puke. That's a great name.
The bands used to refer to us T-shirt sellers as T-shirt pukes, but in truth, it wasn't the bands because I wasn't allowed anywhere near the bands. It was the roadies who called us the T-shirt pukes. But eventually, I took what I'd learned about the business from touring with bigger bands, and I started managing this very eclectic Canadian singer-songwriter whose name is Jane Sibery, who's still performing to this day. And I did that for 12 years. But halfway through that, I actually, because I like to cook just as a regular kind of bachelor cook, and I love to create artwork. When my kid sister moved into her first apartment in college, as a gift to her, I cobbled together a scrapbook, and I called it Bob's Bachelor Basics. And inside it, I put the best of the 6 recipes I knew how to make, and then some tips for living on your own. And then I eventually, I moved here to Los Angeles, and I wasn't really able to pay my mortgage managing Jane and getting, making 20% of almost nothing. And one day a friend said to me, you should write a cookbook. And it was mostly, I think, the wine, the $3 bottle of Trader Joe's wine speaking. But I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to take what I did for my sister and I'm going to blow it up and make it a cookbook, add to it. And so
that cookbook had surreal sort of imagery in it, right?
Well, it did. I called it the Surreal Gourmet because I couldn't afford a photographer for this proposal that in my mind I was going to shop around and get a book deal from. So I illustrated it with my own illustrations that were inspired by my favorite surrealists, those being Salvador Dali and Rene Magritte. And so I called myself and the book the Surreal Gourmet, and then marched into a publisher's office and somehow left with a little baby deal.
The reason that interests me so much is because to me, that all of that experience, the rock and roll, the business school, the, sort of doing this by the seat of your pants, kind of informs your current book. The sort of this kind of Flavourbomb is the name of the book. And it's all about getting the most flavor you can into your food in a cool way, and not a pretentious way, and not a way that requires a whole bunch of expensive ingredients or a bunch of expensive utensils, but just sort of stuff that people can do, right? So let's talk a little bit about how you define a flavor bomb and how you define flavor.
I do what it takes to make stuff taste good. And sometimes I break rules, and sometimes, it's like, oh, you can't put that and that together, or you can't put way too much of this in, or, you're supposed to use a copper pot or a copper bowl to mix it's like, I just know how to make stuff taste really good, and I've gotten fairly good at it. And, I'd like to say I'm a quick study, but my first book, came out like almost 30 years ago. So I'm not really that quick a study.
Let's take an example that you use in the book to talk about flavor. You talk about the Margarita Pizza, which is sort of one of the simplest pizzas you can make, right? But you take it apart in terms of the kinds of layers of flavor that occur in that pizza. Let's walk through that.
Sure. Well, the Margarita Pizza is a good example of when you say simple. I know you're leading the jury here, because there are margarita pizzas, and then there's, oh my God, that's the best margarita pizza I've ever eaten, right? And the difference between the former and the latter is that the former is made in some pizzeria where they take out roll out a piece of dough and slap this on and slap that on, throw it in the oven, and boom, you're done. But a brilliant margarita pizza is a combination of, first of all, great dough, that's treated properly, then cooked in a way that it's, beautifully burnished. You've got the cheeses that sort of give it the, the unctuousness. You've got the tomato sauce with all the umami, and if it's well made, it has lots of layers of flavor. So dough, cheese, tomato sauce, those are the basics. But then that comes out of the oven, and the pizzaioli, usually like a good one, will finish it with some great olive oil, maybe a hit of some good salt, some fresh basil leaves. And they're paying attention to every detail. And long before that, there were a lot of important decisions that were made about the brand of canned tomatoes they would use.
San Marzanos generally, right?
It's very interesting. But because I mentioned that in my book, but subsequent to writing this book, and I do these things all the time, and I should learn never to say things that I haven't actually tasted for myself. I did a tasting, a sort of blind tasting in my own kitchen. I just bought a few different jars because I read about a tasting, and I did it. And sure enough, there was a can of California tomatoes that I thought tasted way better and had a much purer tomato flavor than the 2 or 3 different brands of San Marzanos that I tried. Which brings us to another subject, which is, if you want to learn how to cook in a kind of rogue way, charlatan way, don't trust other people. Learn to trust your own palate. And the best way to do that is to taste things side by side. Get 2 or 3 cans of tomatoes, or hey, start the fun way. Get 2 or 3 vodkas and taste them side by side. And when you're tasting them, I learned this from being a judge at wine competitions. When you taste things side by side, that accentuates the differences. It's not like, I'm just remembering something I tasted 2 weeks ago, and I think this is a little more bitter. It's not like that. You taste one, then you taste the next, then you taste the next, and the differences will really jump out at you.
Sure. Right. So you mentioned 2 kinds of flavors. I mean, people think of, salty, sweet, sour as flavors, but you mentioned unctuousness and umami, sort of the 5th flavor, it's sort of traditionally a sort of mushroomy flavor. But you talk about other kinds of flavors in the book. Can you talk a bit about those?
I'm not sure this is the answer to your question, but there's flavor, there's also texture. Like texture and flavor kind of get intertwined, but when you burnish a pizza crust, which means, you're sort of blackening it, or not to the point where you can carbon date it, but where it's got, really nice marks on it. That creates flavor, and it's the bread is toasting and caramelizing. And then also it's creating a texture, which when you have that juxtaposed with, say, the unctuousness, which is another texture of the cheese, that's part of what makes food explode in your mouth. So it's flavors, it's layers of flavor and layers of texture, and combining those so that there's always points and counterpoints to everything you're doing. And you don't have to think about these things. Like, you don't have to have a checkbox and go, I need some of this and some of that and some of that. But just when you're cooking and you think about a meal, make sure that there's some texture, there's some lusciousness, there's some high notes, some low notes. It's like music, I guess, in a sense,
Absolutely.
It's like composing a symphony.
So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of stuff, the actual sauces and things that you like to use. There's one that I was really taken with was harissa. I think that's sort of it's very, very spicy paste, I guess it is really.
Yeah, well, that's a Tunisian Moroccan paste. You can buy it's like $5 for a tube. It's spicy, but it's not spicy. It's more of a, if you imagine taking chili powder, not chili powder like that you put in chili con carne, but chili like a southwestern chili.
Right.
So, but a powder that's like at about a 6.5 or a 7 in terms of intensity, and mix that with some garlic and some herbs, and then turn that into a paste, probably with some olive oil or whatever they use. It gives you a nice combination of things so that it's not just like putting chili flakes in a pasta sauce. Like, there's more depth of flavor. And so for me, even if I'm scrambling some eggs, I'll just do a little squirt of it from the tube into my eggs as I'm scrambling them, and dump them into the pan. So it's kind of like a little bit of one-stop shopping, just for, as I say, garlic herbaceousness, and a little bit of heat, just a little hotter than, say, a smoked paprika.
Right. So I want to come back to, you were talking about texture, and there's a number of really cool kitchen utensils that you suggest using, like microplanes and panini makers. But one of them is the xinhua, which is a sort of conical sieve, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that brings to the texture of a soup that you would make from that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite things. So a xinhua, I suspect the name comes from the other term that is used in the kitchen, probably not politically correct anymore, but a china cap. And so it's a pointy sieve, or like fine mesh strainer. The ones that are used in restaurants are super fine mesh, and so they're a little bit expensive. They can be, well, I've seen them as inexpensive as about $35, and they can be up to about $100. But it's basically a fine mesh sieve. And so let's say you make a soup. I'm just trying to pick one that I like. Well, an asparagus soup, for example, in this season. So it's asparagus and onion and some chicken stock, and then you blend it to make it nice and smooth. Now, if you have a Vitamix, you could probably just blend it till it's as smooth can be. But if you put that I don't have a Vitamix. So if I put that in my blender and I blend it, it seems pretty smooth. And if I taste it, it's relatively smooth. But if I take that soup, push it through the chinoise. So when I say push it through, is you put it in the chinoise, you use the back of a ladle, and you press down with the back of the ladle into the very conical part of the cone. I could take a gallon of soup, and I might only end up with a small hand, like palmful of the fiber that the chinois will trap. But so let's just say, for argument's sake, a third of a cup out of a gallon of soup will end up as fiber that stays behind in the chinois. But the difference in mouthfeel between the soup straight out of the blender and the soup after it's passed through the chinois almost makes it feel like it's a cream soup. But there's not an ounce of cream added to it. It has that velvety texture that's so pleasing to the mouth. And so to me, that's like a great example of a chef trick, like a professional chef trick, that if you haven't experienced that and sort of tasted them before and after, you wouldn't appreciate how much of a difference can be made from eliminating such a small amount of fiber from the soup.
So let's talk about mouthfeel a bit, because you've got me, after I read your book, I hauled out our panini maker from the basement. And the other day I made an apple and smoked cheddar sandwich with the mayonnaise on the outside to cook in the panini. So I wasn't adding any more calories to it, but I was adding a ton of mouthfeel and a ton of flavor. So let's talk about what a panini maker does that adds that flavor bomb.
Sure. Well, so just for people who might not, the word panini doesn't conjure up an appliance. A panini maker it's like a waffle maker, but it has a sort of rippling kind of plates, two metal plates. And when you toast either just a single piece of toast or a grilled cheese sandwich in it, the weight of the top of it presses down, and these undulating grooves press into the bread and toast it, and then give it this sort of wavy feature. But in a sense, it's doubling the amount of surface space that gets crispy. And at the same time, because the plates get so hot, it's not like a toaster with ambient heat that's toasting the bread. It crusts it. And so you really do, it's like the Doritos commercial. You can hear the crunch when you bite into a piece of bread or a grilled cheese sandwich that you have made on the panini maker. And also, if you want to make bruschetta, for example, you take a piece of bread, you put it in the panini maker, you toast it up. And then as you rub the garlic across the top of the bread, these grooves sort of grab more of the garlic, and it just makes it so much easier to do that. Then you drizzle some olive oil and put on some tomato or some prosciutto, sorry. And then you've got a delicious, pretty quick snack. Right. I love my panini maker so much that when I used to go to Toronto and to shoot my first show, Surreal Gourmet, for the summers, I literally took my panini maker with me in my suitcase.
That's great. So let's wrap up. The book wraps up with some great recipes, and I wanted to talk about one of them, the umami burger, because that really speaks to how you amp up the flavor. So let's talk about how you take that burger and ramp up the umami flavor in it.
Umami, as you mentioned, is like the fifth flavor. It's that very sort of mushroomy type flavor. It's very meaty. Even if you're using umami in a vegetarian restaurant, you can create very meaty flavors. But if you're adding some of the traditional umami forward ingredients to a burger, which is already meaty and has already got natural umami in it, you can kind of, take the dial from a 9 to a way past 11 in terms of to make a Spinal Tap recipe.
Yes, I knew you were going to make a music reference at some point. Yeah.
You really can amp up these umami flavors. So I start with the best blend of meat that I can find. And aged meat, by the way, when you use aged beef in a burger blend, has that natural umami funk to it already. So that's always a great start. But then I add Worcestershire sauce, which has umami, some mushroom powder. I always seem to have some dried morel mushrooms around. I did an episode of my show, Glutton for Punishment, where I was picking morel mushrooms. And then I've also, I've become very familiar with them. And then I befriended a mushroom forager in Prince George, where I go once or twice a year to do events. And so I've got these dried morels. So I take a couple of those and put them in a mortar and pestle and grind them into a dust. So I've got the morels, the mushroom powder, the Worcestershire sauce, which I'm pronouncing incorrectly, and then my secret ingredient, which is Vegemite. Right. Yeah. And I add a little bit of that. And then I like to caramelize some onions, which also have lots of umami, and add some blue cheese, which has lots of umami. So you put that all together, maybe even some of my homemade ketchup that I have a recipe for in my book, which is more like a tomato chutney. Put all those things together with some beautiful meat, aged ground beef, and you've got a burger that just has a depth of flavor that doesn't compare to just an off-the-rack hamburger.
It's really cool. So, Bob, thanks very much for sort of doing a Flavourbomb jam session with us. And I really enjoyed talking to you, and I really enjoyed using some of the tips and techniques you put in your book to try to amp up my own cooking, which needs a lot of amping up. So thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure spending a bit of time with you and with your audience, and I'm honored that you're interested in what I've been writing about. So thank you very much.
That was Bob Blumer, full of flavor, piss, and vinegar in Los Angeles. Steve Maxell wants everyone to fall in love with MIG welding. MIG welding? It stands for metal inert gas welding. It's a simple form of electrical welding you can get into for a few $100s and a bit of practice. If you think welding is all about acetylene torches, Iron Man-style helmets, and years of training, you're in for a surprise, because the technology has really come down in size, price, and complexity. So much so, anyone can learn how to do simple welds at home. Steve's been teaching folks about how to do just that. Here's our conversation about welding for the rest of us. Hey, Steve, thanks for joining us again. We're going to be talking about MIG welding today. First of all, for folks who don't know exactly what MIG welding is, can you describe it really quickly?
MIG welding is one of a handful of different welding processes, so different ways of fusing pieces of metal together so that they're joined and they become one. MIG, the word MIG is an acronym, actually, and it stands for metal inert gas, and it describes a process that is really very simple, fairly inexpensive, easy to learn for joining, all kinds of metal, but especially something called mild steel, which is most of the steels that you see around.
It strikes me, I was looking at some of the MIG equipment and thinking about when I was a kid in Halifax, seeing welders on the decks of aircraft carriers using acetylene torches and big masks and stuff, that the MIG equipment that's out now is sort of like, if that stuff was DSLRs, this stuff is like smartphone photography.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great analogy. Today's modern MIG welding equipment has greatly simplified the process. You can get a decent, simple MIG welder for a couple of $100s. Expensive than that, but for a couple of $100, you can get into the game. And those smaller machines, they're the size of 4 or 5 boxes of Kleenex, maybe. Entirely portable. The way I like to describe it is it's kind of like a hot melt glue gun for metal.
Well, you've got a wire that's melted by the arc of electricity between the metal and the probe, the thing you're holding in your hand. And then the cool thing I think about it is you've got this inert gas, it's argon and carbon dioxide or nitrogen, that surrounds it so it doesn't get polluted by oxygen. So it's a pretty cool little process that's all built into this relatively small device.
Yeah. And it's the fact that those processes are automatically built into the MIG welding approach. That's what makes MIG welding so easy to master. I'm just thinking you've got a handheld gun, which is connected to the welder with a cable, and you squeeze the trigger, and 3 things happen. One is that there's a small wire that comes out at the end of the gun, and that there's a motor inside the welder that pushes fresh wire at the gun. So that's always adding new metal to the weld area. The second thing that happens is that the little wire is electrified. So now an arc starts to jump between the tip of the wire and your workpiece, and that generates the heat that melts the wire. And the third thing that happens, not always, I say, but in some MIG processes, you also have this colorless, odorless, inert gas that floods over the area, as you say, to protect the molten weld pool from reacting with oxygen. And you put those 3 things together, and in less than half an hour, I can take a person who's never welded anything in their life, and in less than half an hour, they're going to be able to weld things decently and strongly.
So let's talk about 2 of the aspects there. You talked about being able to take somebody and teach them how to do welding really quickly. So let's talk about that person. Who is the person? Who's sort of the target audience for MIG welding and teaching people how to MIG weld?
Well, it's surprisingly varied. In my online welding course, I have helped so far about 150 people to learn how to do MIG welding. And that group of people includes men and women, older, younger, urban, rural. It's quite a cross-section. So someone might want to get into MIG welding in order to do repairs and small fabrications, and they can do that in their garage, even in an urban setting. Other people that I've helped are interested in artistic metalwork. So they're interested in welding together pieces of metal so that it looks nice in a kind of a sculptural way. There are people like me who live in the country, and we have machines and things that we want to fix or make parts for. I probably weld once every week or two for purposes like that. So it really varies quite a bit. It's quite an eclectic audience that's interested, I find.
It's pretty cool. So if people want to learn more about the course that you offer in MIG welding, how do they do that?
Well, it's pretty easy. You just go to baileylineroadlearning.com, and that will take you to a place where you can see what the course is all about, and you can sign up if you want. And part of the course, I think it's probably the most important part of the course, is the fact that in addition to the videos and the photos and the text and the illustrations, people also have access to me. So it's actually an instructor-led course where there's backing and forthing between each of the learners and myself. And that makes sense because everybody has different challenges. Everyone has different questions. Should I buy this machine? Should I buy that machine? What about this helmet? What about those gloves? What am I doing wrong here? People send me pictures and videos of welds they've attempted, and maybe they're not as great as they should. What can they do? That sort of thing.
Well, Steve, thanks very much for telling us a little bit more about MIG welding and introducing folks to the glue gun of the future. So thanks very much for joining us.
Well, my pleasure, Wayne. Thank you.
That was our DIY guy, Steve Maxell from Manitoulin Island. And as Steve said, to check out his courses, you can visit baileylineroad.com and just click on the courses section of the site. Thanks, Steve. So, here we are at the end of this episode of Harrowsmith Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to this podcast at Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast player. And please tell your friends and family. Got feedback? We'd love to hear it. You can email us at letters@harrowsmithmag.com. That URL, harrowsmithmag.com, is also where you can order subscriptions online. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on newsstands of selected stores across Canada. Until next time, for Harrowsmith Radio, I'm Wayne McPhail. And also, until next time, remember these 4 words: make, grow, sustain, share. Tune in for the next episode of Harrowsmith Radio.